European Union ambassadors say from Aden that solution to the conflict in Yemen can never be by force. The United Nations Special Envoy Hans Grunberg concludes visit to UAE after talks with UAE officials over Yemen. Houthi ballistic missile attack kills 13 civilians and injures others in Ma'rib Governorate. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Rana Swaylam. The European Union delegation to Yemen concluded their visit to Yemen's interim capital Aden yesterday. The EU officials expressed concern over Houthi offensive on Ma'rib and called for immediate stop of the military escalation in the city. During their visit, EU diplomats held a number of meetings, including the Prime Minister, Governor of Aden, some political factions, civil society, women representatives, and the Chamber of Commerce. The EU diplomats stressed that a unified government serving the interest of all Yemenis is needed on the ground. Further, they showed their great concern about the situation in Al-Abdiyah, stressing that solution to the conflict in Yemen can never be by force. The UN Special Envoy for Yemen, Hans Grunberg, concluded his first visit to the United Arab Emirates after meeting with senior UAE officials, some political Yemeni factions, and the private sector delegates. Grunberg had intensive talks on Yemen with the diplomatic advisor to the UAE President Anwar Girgash and the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Khalifa Shaheen. They all expressed concern over the rapidly deteriorating situation in Yemen and the recent military escalation. By the end of the talks, the UN envoy stressed that progress in peace must be made soon in terms of political, economic, and security priorities. A recent Stanford-led study found that an oil spill from the decaying Safer tanker could increase cardiovascular and respiratory cases and disrupt access to food and water for millions of Yemenis. More details on this story are within this report.
An abandoned oil tanker in the Red Sea containing 1.1 million barrels of oil is at risk of spilling and leaving millions of people in Yemen without water. The FCO Safer was abandoned approximately 5 nautical miles off the coast of Yemen in 2015 due to the ongoing civil war in the country. The tanker is at risk of leaking due to the deterioration of its hull catching fire through the buildup of volatile gases or through a direct attack. Talks between Houthi rebels and the UN-recognized government of Yemen and the UN about the potential spill have stalled despite warnings. A recent study led by researchers at Stanford University School of Medicine used thousands of simulations to predict the impact an oil spill would have on public health. The researchers modeled the potential spill under a variety of weather conditions, taking into account past wind patterns, currents, sea temperature, salinity, and seasonal and daytime fluctuations in weather. This could exacerbate shortages of critical supplies and could disrupt 38% of Yemen's fuel needs, causing fuel prices to spike and risking the closure of hospitals. Clean water supply to millions of people would be threatened due to contamination of plants. All of Yemen's Red Sea fisheries would be at risk. Some 8.4 million people may not be able to access food aid in the event of a catastrophe, while all of Yemen's Red Sea fisheries would also be at risk. In the end, if Houthis' obstinance continues and the UN team of maintenance would not have access to this aid oil tanker, a disaster would threaten not only Yemen but the entire region.
To the south of Ma'rib, 13 civilians have been killed and others injured in a Houthi ballistic missile in Al-Juba. According to local authorities, during the past hours, rescue teams retrieved 7 bodies from under the rubble of Sheikh Abdul Latif Al-Qibli's house in Al-Amud area. Houthi missile shelling on Al-Amud area came a day after targeting Jarsha with more than 20 mortar shells, causing injury to dozens of civilians, destroying their properties and displacing more than 500 families.
كما تلاحظون لا زال البحث جاري Search is still going underway to retrieve bodies from under the rubble. Houthi militia wants Yemenis to flee and not live in peace. About 10,000 families have been displaced. In addition, 300 civilians were killed as a result of the militia's continuous targeting of residential areas.
To that end, the Minister of Legal Affairs and Human Rights, Ahmed Arman, called on the international community to intervene and stop Houthi repeated indiscriminate shelling of residential areas in Ma'rib. According to Arman, Houthi attacks resulted in the death and injury of hundreds of civilians, including women and children, and the displacement of more than 10,000 families within a month. In Al-Qasara, government forces backed by tribes thwarted a Houthi infiltration attempt. According to military sources, the operation ended with most of the infiltrators either dead or wounded, while the rest of them fled. This comes hours after the artillery of the government forces and tribes bombed gatherings of Houthi militia on Al-Masjah front, causing heavy losses among them. Despite their claimed victories in a number of fronts, including Ma'rib, Houthis are confronted with fierce resistance from the government forces and tribes fighters. This report sheds more light on the considerable losses among the rebels in Al-Jarsha area.
Battles in Ma'rib Governorate intensified, especially in the south, where developments occurred and took a dangerous turn. Houthi militia had escalated their attacks on Al-Juba district a week ago, reaching all the way to Al-Jarsha area after members of the militia infiltrated villages and homes of citizens there. This made government forces in a critical situation, forcing them to retreat from those areas where civilians are still there, especially in villages and central market of Al-Jarsha.
Houthi militia uses citizens and homes as human shields. We call on the government to preserve security and impose stability. We reject the militia's rule and the armed groups. No to the militia, we want a unified state.
Yemen Today camera reached front lines of contacts on the southern frontiers and documented the battles. Bullet sounds dominated the scene. Confrontations continued. The militia tried to advance towards the positions of tribes and government forces. They believed that these advancements would resolve in their favor. Government forces, however, monitored the militia's movements. Fierce confrontations lasted for several hours. More than 15 members of the militias were killed. Reinforcements were targeted by airstrikes near Jabal Murad Junction, and artillery destroyed Houthi gatherings in the same front.
Ma'rib
is not easy to get or to control. Houthis will never enter into Ma'rib. Houthis are stuck and they lose in the mountains, not as their false media claims. Government forces still in control despite Houthis' use of civilians against us. The National Army and resistance are steadfast in their positions, and there are no withdrawals, as promoted by the malicious, fallacious media.
Military observers believe that confrontations in Al-Juba district is raging more intensely, and it is difficult to resolve the battle for any party. Houthi militia are pushing forward, hoping to control the oil-rich city. Meanwhile, government forces and tribesmen believe that this battle is their decisive and most important battle. A new course of battles in the southern fronts of Ma'rib. Hundreds of militia members are killed or wounded, either by airstrikes or field battles. This makes course of battles in favor of the government forces, whom they destroyed Houthi militia's hopes of seizing the oil-rich Ma'rib.
Irani-backed Houthi militia moved human and military reinforcements from 7 Yemeni governorates towards Ma'rib and Western Coast fronts. According to sources, reinforcements are estimated at 350 militants who were shoved towards the Ma'rib fronts, while other human reinforcements estimated at 80 militants were sent towards the fronts of the Western Coast. Sources added that most of the reinforcements were transferred from Sana'a and Damar towards Ma'rib, Al-Bayda and Chabwa, while other militants were moved from Damar towards the Western Coast. As for Hodeidah, the joint forces managed to put out fire sources for the Houthi militia on 3 fronts. A military source said that the joint forces detected Houthi fire sources targeting their military sites in the 50th Street sector and City Max and were able to deal with them with the proper weaponry. The source added that the militias targeted residential areas in Al-Durayhimi, where the joint forces directed focused strikes on the hideouts and barracks of the Houthi militias, causing material and human losses. Turning to Ib, the Irani-backed rebels stormed a private hospital and confiscated its assets. Sources said that the Houthi gunmen stormed Al-Manar Specialized Hospital and closed the general director office. The incident comes as a step to control the hospital after spending months to seize it through similar incursions. In Amran, however, the governorate witnessed a brutal murder when the terrorist militia killed a child in Al-Asha district. According to the Minister of Information, Houthis killed the 8-year-old child, Abdullah Saleh Dublain, while he was fetching water for his family from a well in Wadi Mur. Coming next. The United Nations says nearly 500,000 Yemeni displaced children are out of school this year.
راتب الواحد 120 ألف والكيس الدقيق ب18 ألف والكيس السكر اليوم ب20 ألف. كم بعلي بيعطي هذا الراتب كامل كيس سكر وكيس دقيق؟
المواطن اليمني يعيش في أزمة إنسانية وغذائية مؤلمة من غلاء الأسعار وفحشة الأسعار وغلاء الصرف والعملة الأجنبية في البلد.
حالتي الحين حالة لما أخرج لما ندي 12 كيلو ما نقدرش ناكل الأكل داخل ما إحنا بحاجة صعبة.
Welcome back. The United Nations confirmed that more than 500,000 displaced children in Yemen are out of school this year. This is because most of schools were destroyed during the war, and the remaining ones lack basic equipment. According to the UN, without appropriate support, these children may not be able to return to school, warning that the cycle of poverty increases their exposure to the risk of exploitation and abuse. Being out of school, girls are more likely to be forced into early marriage, and boys are more likely to be coerced into child labor or recruited into battlefields. A number of UN reports has warned that the ongoing war has deprived millions of Yemeni children from joining schools. This could make them easily recruited by Houthi rebels and a subject of different abuses. More on this is within this report.
During the past 5 years, about 500 schools were attacked, and more than 2,500 schools were damaged due to the conflict in Yemen. Schools that were used to educate children and upbring their behavior became collective shelters for displaced families and are occupied by armed groups, which led to forcing about 400,000 children to leave schools. Organizations urged all parties to stop attacks against schools, remove arms, and protect children in times of armed conflict. This, along with ensuring humanitarian access so students can safely access education. The educational process is not affected only by war, it's also affected by a Houthi mindset that buys on the educational content. Houthis, according to educational sources, stuffed the content with materials that serve their familial and extremist mindset. This Houthi crime adds to the woes of education, and children who are required by the rebels to be sent to the war fronts instead of schools. The Houthi deformation process aims, according to experts, at defacing the national identity of Yemen and replacing it with another Iranian-aligned agenda. Difficulties of education in Yemen, however, continue with lack of facilities. Pressure on government-run schools is mounting after the private schools raised their fees by nearly 35%. As to the parents, they are confronted with many economic hurdles and struggle to strike a balance between the future of their children and the basic necessities of their life. all of that called upon the government and the international community to help Yemen in its identity-saving struggle.
The mad war in Yemen has caused immense suffering, especially for internally displaced people nationwide. The following report has more on that story.
Year after year, the Houthi rebels are causing the displacement of tens of thousands of Yemenis, uprooting them from their areas and villages, imposing a life of displacement on them. The insistence of the Houthi militias to create new fighting fronts renews the displacement cases throughout Yemen and aggravates the humanitarian crisis in the country, in which the Houthis are implicated. The International Organization for Migration announced the number of displaced people affected by the war reaches 50,000 displaced people in 13 Yemeni governorates since the beginning of the year 2021. The organization said that the eruption of the Ma'rib front by the Houthis and its escalation since the end of last July, in addition to the outbreak of battles in Al-Bayda governorate, forced at least 651 families to flee to 2 governorates and to neighboring governorates. The organization reported that 1 million people were displaced through the governorate, in addition to the registration of the International Organization for Migration last July of 1,120 new displaced people in need of urgent assistance. The organization expressed its concerns in the event of changes along the front lines, which may lead to the displacement of more people to the city of Ma'rib and the surrounding areas. The organization indicated that in the first quarter of this year, 8 IDP sites were emptied in Sirwah due to the approaching battles. At least 15 sites for the displaced were exposed to floods at the end of last July in the city of Ma'rib. This caused damage to about 826 families, destroying their shelters and properties, according to the organization, which led to the displacement of these families. The displaced suffer from difficult humanitarian conditions, with the weak response of international organizations operating in the country, especially with the onset of winter. This is a humanitarian crisis, and all organizations should look forward into assessing this issue.
The faculty union at Hadramaut University has approved immediate suspension of studying starting from next Sunday. The union said in a statement the suspension will continue until the local authorities and the head of the university take sufficient measures to ensure safe environment of education, as well as practical mode of transportation for students and professors to university in the current economic status. On the same context, students of Sayoun University staged a protest condemning the deterioration of the economic and living conditions and the high prices of oil derivatives. Protesters called authorities to intervene to stop the deterioration of the exchange rate of the national currency. The students expressed their discontent with the rise in the price of oil derivatives, which led to the increase in transportation prices. To Aden, the central bank suspended 7 money exchange companies after a comprehensive review of all their accounts and activities. The central bank referred those companies to the judicial and security agencies to complete the implementation of the necessary legal procedures based on the bank's decision. The National Committee Against Coronavirus announced 22 new cases of the COVID-19 in 5 governorates. Committee officials said on Twitter that 10 cases were recorded in Aden, 5 in Al-Mahra, 3 in Al-Bayda, 2 in Hadramaut and 2 in Ma'rib. Also, 3 deaths were recorded plus 17 recovered cases. With the current updates, the total confirmed cases are 9,773, including 1,877 deaths and 6,358 cases of recovery. Here's a reminder of the main headlines. European Union ambassadors say from Aden that solution to the conflict in Yemen can never be by force. The United Nations Special Envoy Hans Grunberg concludes visit to UAE after talks with UAE officials over Yemen. Houthi ballistic missile attack kills 13 civilians and injures others in Ma'rib Governorate. This is the end of the news. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.